We finally got some precipitation here in the desert, and I have to say this is probably one of the few cities that get an absolute hard-on just for water falling from the sky. People walk around with their tiny little chodes upright and their nipples so hard just because they ran into a couple of puddles on their way to work. It is nice to get rain. You get the dirt smelling a little bit delicious sometimes, and anytime you look out of a window while it's raining, you feel like you're in some really expensive music video or like the ending montage to a really good movie. And then I woke up this morning and it looked like the last level to like Resident Evil or Silent Hill. It's a little difficult to tell in the video, but the fog was insane. I really had to use my spidey sense to get to work this morning. But anyways, enough of this nonsense. Let's get straight into today's video. And no, I do not have any connections in Coalition. I don't have an insider. This is basically just kind of a wish list or a speculation list on actors that we would like to see portray some of the Gears of War characters in the upcoming live action adaptation of Gears of War, which, as we all know, Netflix just recently acquired. The list was basically put together based on a few things. Primarily the former roles that some of these characters have had before, some of these actors, and ultimately the question is, would they be able to portray one of these characters from the Gears of War lore on screen? That's what we're going to dive into today. As is always the case, this is my personal opinion. I'm very curious to see what you guys have to say in the comment section. Let me know what actor you guys would like to see in the live action Netflix adaptation of Gears of War. Anyways, let's get straight into it with number 5. We're talking about Taylor Kitsch, who is most well known for being John Carter. I'm totally kidding with you guys. His biggest role, let's be brutally honest, was portraying Tim Riggins on Friday Night Lights. It was a television series that ran from 2006 all the way to 2011, where, as I mentioned, he played Tim Riggins, who was a tight end for the Dillon Panthers. He played his role as an athletic young teenager extremely well, and he got widely recognized for that particular show, but he's gone on to do some other pretty memorable films, mostly just action flicks, nothing too intense or dramatic. He would go on to eventually star in films like The Savages and Lone Survivor. He was also one of the main stars in the film American Assassin. Most recently, the majority of his projects have been TV shows. However, most of his roles are very down-to-earth, very gritty, and because all of the roles that he's had in his career have had a lot to do with weaponry, I'm sure that he has some sort of tactical training. And most people who aren't too familiar with him will skim over his resume and assume that he's a one-dimensional actor. But if anybody has ever watched the series Wacko, where he plays David Koresh, who's basically this demented leader of somewhat of a cult, he really showed his wide range of capabilities as an actor who, for the most part, was known mostly, like I mentioned, for action flicks. But he was finally able to show that he is capable of handling a serious drama role as well. Next up on our list for number 4, we have Tom Hardy. Yes, he will probably need platform shoes considering he's only about 5'7", but we've seen him have very significant roles in Hollywood recently, aside from his Venom films, which were decent for the most part. But I think a lot of the films that really resonate with Gears of War fans will be, for example, Mad Max. It was not only an action film, but it was a post-apocalyptic action film, which kind of ties into the narrative of Gears of War. He was also in Dunkirk, as well as The Revenant, where he was basically the antagonist, and in both times he was absolutely stellar. Not to mention, he did also portray Bane in The Dark Knight Rises. He also starred next to Shia LaBeouf in Lawless, and he also had some minor films that only die-hard Tom Hardy fans will know of, and that is The Drop, which is kind of a very low-budget crime drama. But as I mentioned with Tyler, he's not a one-dimensional actor. He's portrayed multiple characters throughout his entire career, and I think he has shown tremendous ability to be able to handle a role in the Gears of War universe. At number 3, we have another big-time TV actor. We're talking about Norman Reedus, who not only has had a great run, like I mentioned, with TV series. Most noticeably, he was Daryl on The Walking Dead. He also played some minor roles for some low-budget action flicks here and there, nothing too major. But for those of us that are big-time gamers that have been gaming for a pretty big part of our lives, we're very familiar with Norman Reedus for other reasons aside from The Walking Dead, and that's the fact that he has participated in a couple of games thus far. He was obviously the main protagonist in Death Stranding, where he basically played Sam, who was a delivery man in the future in a post-apocalyptic universe. Even though the video game as a whole was pretty heavily criticized for a number of reasons, his performance was never put into question. His biggest role, I think, for gamers definitely has to be the PT demo that was released almost 8 years ago, or almost 9 years ago, I should say, who was being put together by Kojima himself. He was obviously supposed to be the main protagonist, but the game was eventually canceled, and we never really got to see the game completed aside from a demo that you could download. Regardless, as I have been mentioning, this particular actor, just as the last two on the list, they just have this ruggedness to them, and they've played characters before that I think are just perfectly fitting. He is one of the older characters on the list, though, in his early 50s, so hopefully this film can actually get underway to finally see Norman Reedus in another big blockbuster project aside from The Walking Dead. It's been kind of a shame that he hasn't really gotten other opportunities to really showcase his full array of talents. For number 2, we have Aaron Taylor Johnson. He's one of the few actors in the industry that has actually evolved quite a bit since his beginning. He had a few minor roles until he was able to land probably his biggest as Kick-Ass. He had a couple of other mediocre films sandwiched in there, for example, Savages, which I personally did not enjoy at all. But then you had also the sequel to Kick-Ass, which is probably one of my favorite films from him just because it featured Jim Carrey as an absolute badass vigilante. He would eventually slip into the MCU for a short period of time as Quicksilver, only to be killed within that same time frame in the same film. He recently had a very brief but incredibly memorable appearance in the Tenet film, the newest Christopher Nolan project, and he did a fairly good job. As I mentioned before, he didn't really have a lot of screen time. The newest big heavy hitter from him obviously was Bullet Train, which was a good solid film featuring himself, Brad Pitt, Sandra Bullock, and Michael Shannon. I mentioned this previously on the list, but he has had some tactical training. I remember watching a video of him and Keanu Reeves at a shooting range, and he seems incredibly comfortable with the weapon in his hand. So coupled that together with obviously his wider range of experience, I definitely think that he would be a perfect fit for the Gears of War franchise. Before we get to our top spot, I thought we would do a little bit of an honorable mentions list. Either one of these actors, I suppose, could, in theory, fill in the supporting cast, but for one reason or another, I decided to leave them off. Not because they're not good enough actors, but just maybe because their style or their realm of expertise really didn't fit in with the Gears of War franchise or the universe. That's assuming that they keep it consistent with the video games, of course. But anyways, let's get straight into it. Our first honorable mention has to be Ryan Gosling, one of the premier actors of our generation. He's had a plethora of just fantastic roles, from offbeat, quirky, but yet phenomenal performances, like the one that he had next to his co-star Emma Stone in La La Land, which garnered a pretty hefty amount of awards. He's even delved into the realm of romance with films like Stupid Crazy Love, The Notebook, which is an absolute classic. He's also been a part of some phenomenal action films. We have his cult classic Drive, most recently the big blockbuster from Netflix, Gray Man, where he got to co-star next to Chris Evans. And then obviously we have the Blade Runner sequel, which was massively underrated, Blade Runner 2049. A stellar film with a stellar cast. You had Jared Leto in there, Harrison Ford, and obviously Ryan Gosling. The next honorable mention is the Batman himself, Robert Pattinson. Obviously, he started off his career a little bit rocky. His first few films where he was basically a vampire who loved showing off his nipples and his shiny skin. But eventually he actually showcased how versatile of an actor he is. For anybody that hasn't really delved too deep into his repertoire, I highly suggest you guys check out films like Rover and Water for Elephants. He has actually had some very respectable performances. That's not even mentioning some of his newer films like Tenet and Batman, obviously, where he was absolutely brilliant. But those are just the honorable mentions. Let's get straight into the top spot for today's list, and that goes to none other than Jake Gyllenhaal himself, another actor that has become incredibly famous for his versatility on the big screen. There's really no genre that he stays away from. He is known for some fantastic action flicks, for example, like Ambulance, and then obviously you had him in the Far From Home film where he made his MCU debut. But to me, where he really tends to hit his full stride is when he gets an opportunity to play dark, gritty thrillers and sometimes even semi-sci-fi thrillers. For example, you have Prisoners, where he played a gritty, relentless detective, and then you also had Nightcrawler. It was definitely a far cry from what we're used to seeing from him. He was basically this criminal, thief, murderer who would stop at nothing to reach his ultimate goals. But for most of us diehard Jake Gyllenhaal fans, we got introduced to him at a very young age with Donnie Darko, which is probably the darkest, low-budget film that he's ever been a part of, but he gave an absolutely breathtaking performance as Donnie Darko, a troubled young teenager who begins to see visions and starts to kind of question his own sanity, and he eventually meets what has now become one of the most iconic characters of all time in cinema. He meets Frank the Bunny. The film was absolutely well received and it kind of garnished a cult following, but I think it showcased how talented he is. Not only is he capable of beefing up and taking on action roles, but he's also able to handle all of those emotionally draining films. And I personally think that combination just absolutely perfectly suits what the Gears of War franchise is about. Anyways, guys, that is our entire video for today. That is our top 5 actors that we want to see in the Gears of War live action Netflix adaptation. Let me know in the comment section what actor you guys would love to see in the Gears of War upcoming film. Thank you guys for tuning in. I will see you guys in the next one.